My brother stood up, raising his wine glass, and announced to the applauding room that our family's 8 rental houses would naturally belong to him. As Dad nodded, and Mom wiped away tears of pride, I simply set my drink down and smiled. Dad, do you honestly believe today is the first time we have sat down to divide the assets? The room went silent. They had no idea this inheritance distribution had actually finished 2 years ago. My name is Madison Cole, and I was sitting at the far end of a mahogany table that felt less like a piece of furniture and more like a geographic barrier. The air conditioning in my parents' house in Mesa Ridge was humming a low, artificial note, fighting a losing battle against the brutal Arizona heat pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, however, the temperature was perfectly chilled, preserving the pristine, staged quality of the evening. It was a gathering that smelled of expensive roast beef, aged wine, and the distinct metallic scent of betrayal. I watched my brother, Brandon, standing in the center of the room. He looked the part of the golden son today. He was wearing a navy blazer that was tailored just tight enough to suggest he went to the gym, but loose enough to imply he was a man of business. He held a crystal wine glass by the stem, swirling the deep red liquid with a practiced, almost hypnotic rhythm. The light from the chandelier caught the rim of the glass, casting a flickering shadow across his face, momentarily obscuring the smugness that had settled permanently in the corners of his mouth. He had just finished speaking. The announcement hung in the air, heavy and sweet, like overripe fruit. My parents had decided, in their infinite wisdom and selective generosity, to transfer the management and ownership of all 8 rental properties scattered across the desert valley solely to him. It was, as Brandon put it, a deserved reward for his dedication to the family legacy. The applause that followed was polite at first, then enthusiastic, rising in a crescendo that filled the high ceilings of the living room. My aunts and uncles, cousins and family friends, all joined in the chorus. They clapped with the vigor of people who were relieved the drama was over, or perhaps they were just happy the free wine was still flowing. "To Brandon," Uncle Jerry boomed, raising his glass high, "the new landlord of the West." Laughter rippled through the room. It was a warm, inclusive sound, provided you were on the right side of the joke. Then came the comment I had been waiting for. It was inevitable, really. It came from Aunt Sarah, who leaned over to my mother, her voice loud enough to carry over the clinking silverware. "Well, it makes sense, Linda. Brandon has the family spirit. And Madison? Well, Madison is so independent. She doesn't need anything, really. She has her little life in Denver." My mother, Linda, wiped a tear from her cheek with a lace handkerchief, nodding as if Aunt Sarah had just recited a profound scripture. "Exactly," Mom sniffed, beaming at Brandon. "Madison has always been the self-sufficient one. She creates her own path. We are just so proud that Brandon is ready to carry the torch here at home." It was a masterful piece of social engineering. They had taken the act of disinheriting me and repackaged it as a compliment to my strength. I was not being cut out. I was being liberated. I was not being robbed. I was being respected for my independence. I did not clap. I did not smile. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, hidden beneath the tablecloth. My right thumb began to trace the ridges of the silver ring on my left hand. It was an old, heavy piece, turquoise set in tarnished silver. The only thing my grandmother Evelyn had given me directly before she passed away. The metal was cool against my skin, a grounding wire conducting the static electricity of my rage into the earth. I looked at my father, Robert. He sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his face flushed with the wine and the satisfaction of a patriarch who believes he has ordered his kingdom correctly. He looked at Brandon with a reflection of his own vanity. In Brandon, he saw a younger, more malleable version of himself. In me, he saw only a question mark he had never bothered to answer. The noise began to settle as Brandon raised a hand, calling for silence. He picked up a thick stack of papers from the sideboard, the documents of the evening. "Thank you, everyone," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a register that simulated humility. "It is a huge responsibility. Managing 8 properties is no small feat, but Mom and Dad have worked too hard to let these assets just sit there. I promise to take care of them, and to take care of you too." He nodded to our parents. "For the rest of your lives." He paused, glancing briefly in my direction. It was a cursory look, the kind you give a piece of furniture you are afraid you might bump into. "And of course," he added, a benevolent smile plastering itself onto his face, "the lawyers and I have set aside a small stipend structure. Once the portfolio grows, we will make sure Madison gets a little something later on, a nice bonus for the holidays. Maybe." It was the crumb thrown from the banquet table, a promise of a maybe in a future that would never come. The room murmured its approval. What a good brother. How generous. I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest. For years, I had shrunk under this weight. I had made myself small to fit into the spaces they left for me. I had studied in silence, worked in silence, moved to a cold city and built a career in silence. But silence, I had learned, was not empty. It was full of answers. If you knew how to listen. The applause died down completely. The guests were reaching for their forks, ready to celebrate the coronation. I stopped spinning the ring. I placed my hands flat on the table, took a slow breath that filled my lungs with the conditioned air, and picked up my water glass. I did not drink. I just set it back down with a deliberate, audible click against the coaster. The sound was small, but in the sudden lull of conversation, it was sharp. I looked up. I did not look at the guests. I looked straight at my father, then shifted my gaze to Brandon. I curved my lips into a smile. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a grandmaster who watches an opponent move their queen into a trap. "Dad," I said. My voice was calm, clear, cutting through the low murmur of the room like a scalpel. He looked at me, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Madison? We are in the middle of a toast." "I know," I said, keeping my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "I just wanted to ask one thing before everyone gets too excited." I paused. I let the silence stretch for 1 second, then 2. "Dad, are you sure you have read all the papers related to these houses? I mean, really read them?" The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The warmth evaporated. It was as if someone had thrown a bucket of ice water onto the center of the table. The smiles faltered. Forks lowered. Brandon's face darkened. The benevolent brother mask slipped, revealing the bully underneath. "What is that supposed to mean, Madison?" he snapped, his voice tight. "Are you trying to ruin the night? Everything has been drawn up by the family attorney. It is standard procedure." My father frowned, his eyebrows knitting together in a warning glare. "Madison, this has been decided for months. Don't start with your jealousy now. It is unbecoming." "Jealousy?" I repeated the word softly, tasting it. "No, Dad, not jealousy, accuracy." I did not wait for his response. I leaned down slowly to the space beside my chair. There, sitting in the shadows of the tablecloth, was a small black carry-on suitcase. It was scuffed at the edges, practical, unassuming. It looked like something a traveler would use for a weekend trip. But it was heavy. I wrapped my fingers around the handle. The plastic was cool and solid. I lifted it onto the empty chair beside me. The zipper made a distinct, rasping sound as I unzipped the front pocket, just enough to show the edge of a thick, color-coded file. "You see?" I continued, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding my veins. "You keep talking about these 8 houses as if they are yours to give. Dad, and Brandon, you talk about them as if they are yours to take." "They are mine," Brandon spat, stepping forward. "The deeds are right here." He waved the papers in his hand. "Those are drafts, Brandon," I said. "Drafts prepared by a lawyer who hasn't checked the county registry in over 24 months. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath. I looked around the room, at the confused faces of my aunts and uncles, the sudden fear in my mother's eyes, the rising anger in my father's. They thought this was a tantrum. They thought I was lashing out because I was hurt. They thought this was a spur-of-the-moment rebellion from the daughter who had always been pushed to the edge of the frame. They were wrong. This was not an impulse. This was not a scene I was making because I had had too much wine. I rested my hand on the suitcase. Inside were 2 years of forensic accounting. Inside were bank statements tracing every dollar Brandon had siphoned off for his gambling debts. Inside were the notarized documents my grandmother and I had signed in a dusty office in Santa Fe, 18 months before she died. They thought the story ended tonight with a toast to Brandon. They did not know that I had already written the ending 2 years ago. I was just here to deliver the manuscript. "Shall we look at the real paperwork?" I asked. To understand why I brought a suitcase full of forensic evidence to a family dinner, you have to understand the geography of my childhood. In our house, love was a finite resource, and the distribution map was drawn long before I was born. My earliest memories are not of hugs or bedtime stories, but of the distinct difference in volume between 2 days of the year. I remember Brandon's 12th birthday. It was a Saturday in mid-July. The backyard was transformed into a carnival of noise and color. There were 24 guests, a rented inflatable castle that smelled of hot plastic and joyous sweat, and a 3-tiered chocolate cake ordered from a specialty bakery in Scottsdale. I remember my father standing by the grill, flipping burgers with the enthusiasm of a man serving a king, telling everyone who would listen that Brandon was going to be the varsity quarterback by freshman year. The gifts were piled high on the patio table: video games, a new bike, brand new cleats. My birthday falls in November. That year, on my 12th birthday, I came home from school to find the kitchen counter empty. My mother was on the phone, discussing a tenant dispute with a plumber. My father was late coming home from work, around 7 in the evening. After dinner was finished and the plates were being cleared, Mom seemed to remember. She pulled a plastic container from the fridge, a grocery store cheesecake with the price tag still on it. They lit a single candle, sang a rushed version of the birthday song while Brandon complained that he was missing his show. And that was it. By 7:30, I was in my room, doing homework. It was not that they did not love me. They loved me the way one loves a reliable appliance. I was functional. I was low maintenance. I was there. Brandon, however, was the sun around which our domestic solar system orbited. Dinner conversations were exclusively dedicated to his orbit, if he threw a touchdown in practice. We dissected the play for 40 minutes. If he got a C on a history test, it was the teacher's fault for being too rigid, and my parents would spend the evening drafting emails to the principal. I remember bringing home a report card with straight A's in every subject. I placed it on the table next to the salt shaker. My father glanced at it, nodded once, and said, "That is good. Madison, keep it up." Then he turned immediately to Brandon and asked if the coach had mentioned the starting lineup for Friday. My academic excellence was treated as the baseline, a boring necessity that required no fanfare. Brandon's mediocrity was treated as a dramatic struggle worthy of constant intervention and applause. The financial disparity was even more blatant, though they tried to dress it up as pragmatism. When I was 14, I asked for a tutor. I wanted to take an advanced calculus workshop over the summer at the community college. It cost $300. I remember standing in the kitchen, clutching the brochure, explaining how this would help me get into a good university. My mother sighed, the long, weary sigh of a martyr. "We are just a little tight right now." "Honey," she said, "the rental market is slow this quarter. You are smart. Madison, you can study on your own, right? We have to prioritize expenses." I believed her. I felt guilty for even asking. I went to the library and checked out old textbooks instead. Exactly 1 week later, I walked into the garage and saw it. Sitting in the open trunk of my father's SUV was a brand new set of professional-grade football pads and a helmet with a custom visor. The price tag was still dangling from the face mask. $650. I stood there for a long time, staring at the shiny black plastic. I did not cry. I just did the math. $300 for my future was an impossible burden. $650 for Brandon's hobby was a necessary investment. That was the exchange rate of our family. I learned to be the easy child. I heard them say it to their friends at parties. Madison is so independent. She never asks for anything. We are so lucky she is self-sufficient. They wore my neglect like a badge of good parenting. They convinced themselves that my silence was a personality trait, rather than a survival mechanism. At school, the teachers were no better. I was 2 grades behind Brandon. So I walked into classrooms where his reputation had already stained the walls. Mr. Henderson, the gym teacher, called me Brandon twice a week for an entire semester. When I corrected him, he would just laugh and say, "Well, you know who the star of the family is." I was the shadow. I was the background noise. But shadows have one advantage. People forget they are there. And because they forget, they say and do things they would never reveal if they thought anyone was actually watching. This became most apparent during our weekend trips to inspect the rental properties. My father started taking us along when I was about 15. He called it learning the family business, but it was really just a coronation procession for Brandon. We would pull up to a dusty stucco duplex in the valley. My father would toss the heavy ring of keys to Brandon. "Here you go, son," he would say, beaming. "Open it up. You need to get the feel of ownership in your hands. One day, you will be the one collecting the checks." Brandon would fumble with the lock. Making jokes about raising the rent on the single mother living in Unit B, he would strut through the living room, opening the fridge, turning on the TV, acting like a feudal lord inspecting his peasants. Meanwhile, I was handed a clipboard and a pen. "Madison, write down the meter readings," my father would command without looking at me. "Check the filters in the AC unit, count the inventory in the supply closet, make sure the tenant actually fixed that hole in the drywall." So, while Brandon played pretend landlord, I learned the actual business. I learned that Unit 4 had a slow leak in the master bath that my father kept patching with cheap sealant instead of calling a plumber. I learned that the tenant in Unit 6 paid in cash, and that cash often went straight into my father's wallet instead of the business account. I learned how to read a lease agreement, how to spot a fraudulent invoice, and how to calculate the depreciation of assets. I became the invisible secretary. I knew the codes to the lockboxes. I knew which tenants paid on time and which ones were struggling. I knew the profit margins down to the cent. My father and Brandon only knew the gross revenue, the big shiny number they could brag about at the country club. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 16. I was in the home office, looking for a stapler to finish a history project. My father's desk was a mess of papers. He was disorganized, relying on charm rather than order. A file folder had slid off the top of a stack and spilled onto the floor. I knelt to pick it up. It was a loan application for a refinancing deal on one of the larger properties. I should have just put it back, but by then, I had developed a habit of reading everything. Words were the only thing I could trust. I scanned the document. My eyes stopped at the income declaration section. My father had listed the rental income for that property at $3,200 a month. I frowned. I had collected the checks for that property the day before. The tenants paid $2,400. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. I looked at the expenses section. He had listed maintenance costs at $500 a month. I knew for a fact we had spent $0 on maintenance for that house in the last 6 months. The tenant had even complained that the dishwasher was broken, and Dad had told them to wash dishes by hand. I sat there on the floor, holding the paper with trembling hands. The numbers did not add up. This wasn't just an error, it was a fabrication. He was inflating the income to get a bigger loan, and inflating the expenses to lower the tax liability. It was the first crack in the pedestal. My father wasn't just a biased parent. He was a reckless businessman, and Brandon, his chosen heir, was too busy checking his hair in the rearview mirror to notice that the empire he was waiting to inherit was built on quicksand. I put the file back exactly where it had been. I never said a word. But that afternoon, something inside me hardened. I realized that my independence was not just a role they forced on me. It was my only safety net. If I stayed attached to this sinking ship, I would drown with them. The only person who saw me, truly saw me, was Grandma Evelyn. She lived in a small adobe house in Santa Fe, 3 hours away. She was my mother's mother, but she had none of my mother's willful blindness. When we visited, she didn't ask me about school or boys. She would make a pot of strong herbal tea, take me out to the back porch, and we would watch the sunset over the desert. "You have quiet eyes, Madison," she told me once, rocking in her chair. I didn't know what to say, so I just sipped my tea. "Most people look at the world and see what they want to see," she continued, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "Your brother sees a mirror. Your father sees an audience. But you see the cracks in the stucco." She reached out and patted my hand. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You are good at seeing what others miss. Never lose that. It is a lonely gift, but it will save you one day." I didn't know then how right she was. I didn't know that she was already planning, already moving pieces on a board I couldn't yet see. But I did know one thing. I knew I had to get out. I stopped asking for tutors. I stopped showing them my report cards. I stopped hoping that if I just achieved enough, they would finally look at me with the same adoration they gave Brandon. I realized that you cannot buy tickets to a show that is sold out. I started working odd jobs, tutoring other kids, babysitting, organizing files for a neighbor's small business. I saved every penny in a shoebox taped under my bed. I researched scholarships to out-of-state universities, specifically targeting places far away from the Arizona heat and the suffocating weight of my brother's ego. I remember lying in bed the night before I submitted my college applications. I could hear Brandon downstairs, laughing at the TV, shouting for Mom to bring him some popcorn. I stared at the ceiling fans spinning in the dark. I made a promise to myself. "I am going to leave," I whispered to the empty room. "I am going to go where the air is cold and the mountains are high. I am going to build a life where I am not a backup plan. And when I come back, I won't be the secretary holding the clipboard. I will be the one holding the pen." I closed my eyes and imagined a map. I imagined a line drawn from Mesa Ridge to Denver. It looked like a lifeline. It looked like an escape route. I did not know then that escape is only the first half of the story. The second half is the return. And when you return to a place that never valued you, you have to bring more than just your presence. You have to bring leverage. My childhood ended not when I turned 18, but on that afternoon in the home office with the falsified loan document. That was the day I stopped being their daughter and started being their auditor. And auditors do not forget. They just wait for the fiscal year to end. I landed in Denver with 2 suitcases and a full scholarship letter that felt heavier and more valuable than gold bullion. The moment I stepped out of the airport terminal, the air hit me differently. It was not the suffocating, dry kiln heat of Mesa Ridge that baked the moisture right out of your skin. It was crisp, thin, and carried the sharp scent of pine and approaching snow. To me, it smelled like oxygen. It smelled like freedom. I chose a university that was exactly 800 miles away from my parents' driveway. It was a calculated distance, close enough to fly back in an emergency, but far enough to make a weekend surprise visit from my mother impossible. While my peers were drowning in campus parties or rushing sororities, I buried myself in the architecture of finance. I did not want to just make money. I wanted to understand how it moved, how it hid, and how it could be used as a weapon or a shield. After graduation, instead of returning to Arizona to help with the family empire, a suggestion my father made once, half-heartedly, over a static-filled phone line, I accepted an offer at Northwind Analytics. Northwind was a boutique firm in downtown Denver that specialized in forensic data analysis for commercial real estate portfolios. It was a place of glass walls, gray carpeting, and silence. I loved it. For the first time in my life, I was in an environment where being quiet and observant was not a character flaw. It was a billable skill. My job was to take the messy, chaotic books of large development firms and hunt for the story the numbers were trying to tell. I spent 10 hours a day staring at spreadsheets, tracing discrepancies that looked like typos to the untrained eye, but looked like theft to me. I remember my first performance review clearly. My supervisor, a woman named Karen with steel-colored hair and eyes that missed nothing, sat me down. She tapped a report I had submitted on a mid-sized mall project in Boulder. "You found the leakage in the maintenance vendor contracts," she said. "3 other analysts looked at this quarter and missed it. You caught a 4% variance that was bleeding them dry." She did not hug me. She did not throw me a party. She simply nodded and said, "Good work. Cole, here's your bonus." I walked out of her office feeling a sensation I had never experienced in 22 years. I felt seen. I felt heard. And I realized that in the adult world, respect was not a limited resource that had to be hoarded for the golden child. It was something you earned. And once you earned it, it was yours to keep. I rented a studio apartment in the Lodo district. It was small, barely 600 square feet, with exposed brick walls and a view of an alleyway. But I paid for it. Every cent of the deposit, every month of rent, every utility bill came from my own paycheck. When I signed the lease, I did not just scribble my name at the bottom. I sat in the leasing office for 45 minutes, reading every single clause. The leasing agent, a young guy who clearly wanted to go on his lunch break, tapped his pen impatiently. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "No," I said, circling a paragraph on page 4. "But this indemnity clause regarding water damage contradicts the state statute on tenant rights. I need you to strike it before I sign." He looked at me, stunned, then went to talk to his manager. They struck the clause. That night, eating takeout noodles on the floor of my empty apartment, I felt a fierce sense of victory. My family had taught me to be passive, to accept whatever scraps were given. Denver was teaching me that if you read the fine print, you could rewrite the terms of engagement. I still went back to Arizona for holidays. Of course, those visits were exercises in endurance. I would sit on the familiar beige sofa, watching the desert sun beat against the window, and listen to the same old mythology being spun in real time. Brandon had graduated, barely, and was now officially managing the properties. In reality, this meant he drove around in a leased truck with the company logo on the door, collecting rent checks and complaining about how hard his life was. I remember one Thanksgiving, Brandon stormed into the kitchen, throwing his keys on the counter. "You would not believe the day I had." He groaned, grabbing a beer. "The tenant in the prickly pear house kept calling me about the water heater, like I am a plumber or something. I told him to deal with it and send me the bill. But these people are so needy." My mother rushed over to rub his shoulders. "Oh, poor baby," she cooed. "You work so hard. It is a burden, carrying all this responsibility for the family." My father nodded from the table. "That is the price of leadership, son. You are building an empire. You have to make sacrifices." I sat there, cutting a piece of pumpkin pie, thinking about the tenant in the prickly pear house. I knew that water heater was 20 years old because I had logged its serial number when I was 16. It was a fire hazard. Brandon wasn't a martyr. He was negligent. But in that house, Brandon's incompetence was reframed as the heavy burden of nobility. I tried to talk to them about my life. I tried to explain what I did at Northwind. I got promoted to senior analyst. I told them once during a commercial break of the football game, "I am leading the audit on a $50 million acquisition." "That is nice, honey," my mother said, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Did you hear that Brandon is thinking of repainting the duplexes? He has such an eye for curb appeal." I stopped trying. The distance between us wasn't just geographical anymore. We were living in 2 different realities. I lived in a world where contracts were binding, math was absolute, and actions had consequences. They lived in a world where feelings were facts, favorites were laws, and Brandon could do no wrong. Our phone calls became a ritual of superficiality. They would call on Sunday evenings. "How is the weather in Denver?" my dad would ask. "Cold," I would say. Good. Well, we are just looking at a new boat. Brandon thinks we should upgrade the lake house access. He says the market is booming." They spoke to me like I was a distant cousin they were obligated to keep in touch with. I was the spectator in the nosebleed seats, watching the main event of their lives play out on a jumbotron I couldn't switch off. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It was a gray afternoon in late October. The mountains were swallowed by low clouds, and the office was quiet. My computer pinged with a notification. It was an email, not a text, not a call, an email from my mother. The subject line was simply, Grandma. I opened it, my hand hovering over the mouse. Madison, your grandmother Evelyn has been admitted to the hospital in Santa Fe. Pneumonia. Doctors say she is stable but weak. We are driving up on Saturday. Thought you should know. Thought I should know, as if I were a business associate being informed of a delay in shipment. I did not wait for Saturday. I walked straight into Karen's office. I have a family emergency. I said, I need 3 days. Go, she said. Do not check your email. I was at the airport 2 hours later. The flight to Albuquerque was turbulent, the plane shaking as it cut through the winter winds coming off the Rockies. I pressed my forehead against the cold plastic of the window, watching the landscape shift from the snowy peaks of Colorado to the red-scarred earth of New Mexico. I felt a strange, tightening sensation in my chest. It wasn't just fear of losing her. Grandma Evelyn was the only person who had ever looked at me and seen me. Not just a blurred background figure, but there was something else. A pull, a gravity. Why had she not called me herself? We spoke every week. She had sounded fine 3 days ago. And why did I feel like this wasn't just about pneumonia? I rented a car in Albuquerque and drove the hour north to Santa Fe. The sun was setting, painting the desert in violent shades of violet and burnt orange. I drove fast, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't go to the hospital. I had called the nurses' station from the road, and they told me she had been discharged against medical advice that morning. She insisted on going home. I pulled up to her small house on Canyon Road. It was a humble place, surrounded by piñon trees and sagebrush. The adobe walls were thick and cool. The windows were dark. I unlocked the front door with the spare key I had kept on my keychain for 6 years, right next to my apartment fob. The smell hit me instantly. It was the scent of my sanctuary: old paper, dried sage, cedar wood, and the faint, sweet smell of vanilla tea. It was the smell of the only place I had ever felt safe. "Grandma!" I called out, dropping my bag by the door. I expected to find her in bed, tucked under the heavy quilts. I expected the sound of an oxygen machine or the smell of sickness. Instead, I saw a light coming from the dining room. I walked down the short hallway, the floorboards creaking under my boots. She was sitting at the head of the heavy oak table. She looked small, frail. Her silver hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was wrapped in a thick wool cardigan that swallowed her frame. She looked pale, her breathing slightly labored, but her eyes were alert. They were sharp, clear, and fixed on me as I entered the room. She was not eating. There was no soup bowl, no medicine bottles, no thermometer. In front of her, neatly aligned on the polished wood surface, were 2 thick, black binders. They looked out of place in the rustic warmth of the room. They looked like they belonged on my desk at Northwind Analytics. They looked like business. I stopped in the doorway, confused. "Grandma?" I whispered. "Mom said you were in the hospital." She lifted a hand, silencing me. It was a gesture of command I had never seen from her before. "Close the door, Madison," she said. Her voice was thin, like paper tearing, but steady, and lock it. I did as she asked. The lock clicked, a loud sound in the quiet house. I walked over to the table. I wanted to hug her, to check her forehead, to ask her why she wasn't resting, but something in her posture stopped me. She wasn't playing the role of the sick grandmother. She was waiting for a meeting to begin. "Sit," she said, pointing to the chair opposite her. I sat. The 2 binders lay between us like a border wall. "I did not call your parents," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I had the nurse call them with the pneumonia story. It bought us time." "Time for what?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. She placed her hand on the first binder. Her fingers were trembling slightly, not from age, but from a suppressed emotion I couldn't quite place. Anger? Grief? "Time for you to do what you are good at," she said. "Time for you to look at the numbers." She slid the folders across the wood. They stopped right in front of me. I looked down. There were no labels on the spines, just black leather and the weight of secrets. I looked back at her. Her face was grim, stripped of the gentle grandmotherly softness I was used to. "Your brother and your father think ink on a page is just decoration," she said. "They think they can charm the math into agreeing with them." She leaned forward, and the shadows deepened on her face. "I need you to show them that the math does not care about their charm. Open them. Madison." I reached out. My hand hovered over the cover of the first binder. The room was silent. Save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, I felt a cold chill run down my spine, a premonition that once I opened this cover, the life I had built in Denver, the safe, separate, quiet life, would collide violently with the life I had left behind in Arizona. I flipped the cover open. The first page wasn't a letter. It was a bank statement, and the numbers on it were screaming. I opened the first binder. It was not a scrapbook. It was a crime scene. To the untrained eye, the pages were just a boring collection of monthly statements, bank transfers, and invoices, but to me, they were a narrative. I switched instantly into my work mode. The emotional fog of seeing my grandmother frail cleared, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of an auditor hunting a discrepancy. I ran my finger down the column of the primary checking account for the Arizona properties. It was a joint account, technically managed by my parents, but with Brandon added as an authorized signatory 18 months ago. I saw the pattern in less than 60 seconds. It was bold. It was stupid. It was the kind of theft committed by someone who has never been told no in his entire life. "Look at the vendor payments," Grandma Evelyn said softly. She was watching my face, reading my eyes as I read the paper. I flipped to the expense section. There were recurring payments to a company called Desert Sky Maintenance. The amounts were always round numbers: $2,000, $1,500, $3,500. In the real world of property management, repair bills are never round numbers. A plumber does not charge you exactly $500. They charge you $487.50 for parts and labor. Round numbers are the red flags of fabrication. I pulled out the corresponding invoices. They were amateurish. Basic word templates with no tax ID number, no detailed breakdown of parts, just generic descriptions like urgent pipe repair or roof maintenance. "Who is Desert Sky Maintenance?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "There is no such company," Grandma replied. "I had a friend at the county clerk's office check the business registry. It does not exist." I flipped back to the bank statements. I traced the routing number on the back of the cashed checks. They were being deposited into a personal checking account at a completely different bank, a bank where I knew my brother had his personal savings. "He is skimming," I said, my voice flat. "He is creating fake emergencies, writing checks to a shell company, and depositing the money into his own account. He has taken over $40,000 in the last year alone." I looked up at her. "Does Dad know?" Grandma let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Your father sees what he wants to see. Brandon tells him the houses are old and need work. Your father nods and signs the tax returns without looking at the line items. He thinks Brandon is working hard to keep the empire standing. In reality, Brandon is stripping the copper wire out of the walls." She reached out and tapped the binder. "I gave him access because I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that if we gave him responsibility, he would grow into the man your parents think he is. But numbers do not lie. Madison, people lie. Numbers just wait to be read." I closed the first binder. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a mixture of rage and professional vindication. I had always known Brandon was spoiled. I had not known he was a criminal. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "We can take this to the police, or at least to Mom and Dad." "No," she said sharply. "If you take this to your parents now, they will find a way to excuse it. They will say he was confused. They will say he intended to pay it back. They will pay the money back themselves to cover for him, and nothing will change. He will still inherit everything, and he will burn it all to the ground within 5 years." She pushed the second binder toward me. Open that one. This binder was heavier. It did not contain bank statements. It contained legal documents, thick, cream-colored paper with watermarks. I opened it to the first page. It was a revocable living trust. The Evelyn Vance Family Trust. I scanned the first paragraph. I expected to see my mother's name, or perhaps a generic distribution to living descendants. Instead, I saw my own name. Successor trustee, Madison Cole. Sole beneficiary, Madison Cole. I stopped breathing for a moment. I looked at the date. It had been drafted 2 weeks ago. Behind the trust document were 8 separate warranty deeds, one for each of the rental houses in Arizona. They were fully prepared, transferring the title of every single property from my grandmother's name, where they had legally remained since my grandfather died, into the trust. I looked up at her, stunned. Grandma, you can't do this. Mom and Dad, they think these houses belong to them. They think they are just waiting for the paperwork to clear. They think that because I let them think that, she said. Her eyes were fierce now. Your grandfather and I bought those houses. We built that equity. Your parents have been managing them. Yes, but the titles never transferred. I kept them in my name for a reason. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. I sat at that dinner table for 20 years. Madison, I watched them ignore you. I watched them buy him cars while you worked night shifts to buy textbooks. I said nothing because I wanted to keep the peace. But I will not let my legacy be used to fund your brother's gambling or your father's ego. She pointed a crooked finger at the document. Brandon is good at talking. He can charm a room. But you, Madison, you are good at reading the things everyone else ignores. This family needs a steward who respects the math, not the applause. She pulled a pen from her pocket. It was a nice pen, a heavy Mont Blanc that had belonged to my grandfather. I need you to sign as the trustee, accepting the responsibility. This will start a war, I whispered. If I sign this, and they find out, they will never forgive me. They will not find out, she said. Not yet. She glanced at the grandfather clock. I have a notary coming in 10 minutes, a woman named Maria from down the street. She is discreet. We will sign everything tonight. We will record the deeds in the morning at the county office here in Santa Fe, and then... She paused, her expression hardening into steel. Then, you will hide these papers. You will go back to Denver. You will let Brandon play his games. You will let your parents plan their big inheritance party. You will let them believe, with absolute certainty, that they have won. Why, I asked. Why wait? Because, she said, leaning back in her chair, power is not just about ownership, it is about timing. If you tell them now, they will fight you, they will harass you, they will try to manipulate me while I'm weak. But if you wait until they have announced it to the world, until they have staked their entire reputation on it, then the truth will not just stop them, it will crush them. There was a knock at the door. Grandma nodded to me. Let Maria in. The next hour was a blur of blue ink and the scratching sound of a pen against paper. Maria, a kind-faced woman who smelled of cinnamon gum, stamped each document with a rhythmic thud-thud that echoed in the quiet house. Thud-thud, the house on Aloe Vera Drive. Thud-thud, the duplex on Canyon View. Thud-thud, the 4-bedroom on Desert Palm. With every stamp, the weight on my shoulders grew heavier. I wasn't just inheriting property, I was inheriting a nuclear bomb. When Maria left, the room felt different. The air was charged with static. Grandma took the second binder, the one with the trust and the signed deeds, and placed it inside a fireproof black folder she had sitting on the floor. She zipped it up. It made a sound like a body bag closing. Take this, she said, handing it to me. Do not leave it here. If anything happens to me, your parents will come here and tear this house apart looking for papers. They must find nothing. I took the folder. It felt warm in my hands. Grandma, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can do this. I am not like you. I am just Madison. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. That is exactly why you can do it. because you are just Madison, the girl they never saw coming. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Remember this rule, little one. Contracts do not have feelings. Deeds do not have favorites. Paperwork does not care who was the captain of the football team. That is your power. Use it. I left her house an hour later. It was pitch black outside. The desert air was freezing. I walked to my rental car, clutching the black folder to my chest. I placed it on the passenger seat and buckled it in, as if it were a passenger. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key. I looked back at the house. The light in the dining room went out. I realized then that my childhood was officially dead. The hope that my parents would one day wake up and love me fairly was dead. The dream of a happy, normal family was dead. But as I put the car in gear and drove away, leaving the gravel dust swirling in my taillights, something else was being born. I was no longer the victim. I was the vault. I was the keeper of the only truth that mattered. They could have their parties. They could have their toasts. They could have their delusions of grandeur. I had the receipts. And as I turned onto the highway, heading back toward the airport and my life in Denver, I touched the black folder one more time. 2 years. I thought, I can wait 2 years. The speedometer climbed to 70, 75, 80. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was lying in wait. Grandma Evelyn passed away 4 months after our secret meeting. It was pneumonia, officially, but I think her body simply decided it had completed its final, most important task. The funeral was in Santa Fe. It was a quiet affair, just as she wanted. I stood by the gravesite, wearing a black dress that felt too tight across the chest, and listened to the priest talk about her gentleness. I did not cry during the service. I was too busy guarding the space between my ribs where the truth was hiding. Every time I looked at my father's somber face or my mother's tear-streaked cheeks, I felt a wave of nausea. They were grieving a woman they thought they knew. I was grieving a co-conspirator. The real funeral, however, did not happen at the cemetery. It happened 3 hours later, back in Mesa Ridge, at the same mahogany dining table where I had spent my childhood being invisible. My parents had asked me to stay the night before flying back to Denver. "We need to decompress as a family," my mother had said, squeezing my arm. It felt like a trap, but I agreed. I needed to see their cards. At 7 o'clock in the evening, I walked into the dining room. It had been transformed. The floral centerpiece was gone. The placemats were gone. In their place was a setup that looked less like a family dinner and more like a corporate acquisition meeting. There was a pot of coffee that smelled burnt. There were 3 ceramic mugs, and in the center of the table, sitting there with the innocence of a loaded weapon, was a single sheet of paper. My father was sitting at the head of the table. He was wearing his reading glasses, the ones he only used when he wanted to look intellectual. Brandon was sitting to his right, drumming a pen against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. He looked impatient, like he had a tea time to catch. My mother was in the kitchen, but she hurried in as soon as I sat down, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She offered me a smile that was tight and anxious. "Coffee, sweetie?" she asked. "No, thank you," I said. I sat in my usual spot, the seat at the edge, the seat with the bad view. My father cleared his throat. It was a theatrical sound. "Madison," he began, clasping his hands together. "We know this is a hard time. We are all missing Grandma. But life has to go on, and there are administrative things we need to handle, to keep the family secure." He pushed the paper toward me. It slid across the polished wood with a soft hiss. "We have been talking with the family attorney," he continued. "Since Grandma did not leave a formal will that we can find, the estate goes into probate. It is a long, messy process, expensive too. Taxes, fees, court dates. We want to avoid that." I looked down at the paper. The header read, "Waiver of interest and quitclaim deed." It was a legal document in which the undersigned, me, voluntarily relinquished any and all claims to the estate of Evelyn Vance, specifically the 8 residential properties listed in Exhibit A. I scanned the list of addresses: Aloe Vera Drive, Canyon View, Desert Palm. They looked so small on the page, just lines of black ink, but I knew the truth. I knew that Aloe Vera Drive had a new HVAC unit that Brandon had billed for but never installed. I knew that Canyon View generated $2,400 a month, not the $1,800 my father reported to the IRS. Basically, my father said, his voice taking on a casual, reasonable tone, we are trying to simplify things. You live in Denver, Madison, you have your own career, you are busy. You are not here to deal with tenants calling at midnight or roofs leaking in the monsoon season. He gestured to Brandon. Your brother is here. He has been managing the properties for years. He knows the business. It makes the most sense for him to take over the title and the responsibility. This document just says that you agree to step aside so we can transfer everything to him without the government taking a huge chunk in taxes. I remained silent. I kept my eyes on the paper. My mother sat down next to me. She reached out and covered my hand with hers. Her palm was warm, but her touch felt cold. It is for the best, honey, she said softly. You know how stressful money can be. We don't want to burden you. You have always been so independent. We are so proud of that. This way. Brandon takes on the heavy lifting, and you can just focus on your life in the city. Burden, that was the word they used. As if stripping me of my inheritance was an act of charity. Brandon stopped tapping his pen. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Look, Maddie, he said. He used the nickname I hated. The legal stuff is complicated. The market is weird right now. Dad and I have a strategy to leverage the equity, but we can't do it if the title is split up or stuck in probate. You don't understand how these assets work. It is not like the spreadsheets you play with at work. This is real estate. I felt a sharp spike of adrenaline in my chest. I don't understand? I spent my days auditing commercial portfolios worth $500 million. I could spot a shell company laundering money in 3 clicks. I could read a trust indenture backward, and he was sitting there, telling me I didn't understand the complexity of 8 stucco houses in a suburb. But I didn't say that. Not yet. I looked at the document again. At the bottom, there was a blank line next to my name. Signature of Madison Cole. If I signed this, I would be agreeing to their version of reality. I would be validating their narrative that I was the outsider, the one who didn't count, the one who was lucky to be excused from the burden of wealth. If I signed this, the trust my grandmother created would eventually supersede it. Of course, my lawyer had told me that a waiver signed under false pretenses, or conflicting with a pre-existing trust, would be messy, but ultimately beatable. But that wasn't the point. The point was the act. They were asking me to erase myself. They were handing me the eraser and telling me it was a gift. Brandon sighed, loud and exaggerated. Come on, Madison, it is just a signature. We have dinner reservations at 8. My father nodded. Just sign it so we can move on, he said. It is what Grandma would have wanted. The family united, no lawyers fighting. That was the line that did it. What Grandma would have wanted. I thought about the night in her dining room, the smell of sage and old paper, the way her hand shook when she handed me the black folder. She didn't want unity. She wanted justice. She didn't want peace. She wanted correction. I remembered her voice. Contracts do not have feelings. I looked at the pen Brandon was holding. He was offering it to me. I took the pen. The room seemed to exhale. My mother squeezed my hand tighter. My father smiled, a relieved, condescending smile. They thought I was capitulating. They thought the system was working exactly as it always had. The big brother takes, the little sister yields. I held the pen over the paper. I watched the ink tip hover centimeters above the line. Then, very slowly, I capped the pen. I placed it gently on the table, right next to the coffee mug. I picked up the waiver with both hands. I did not crumble it. I did not tear it. I simply aligned the edges perfectly, lifted it, and set it down in the center of the table, closer to my father than to me. I will not sign this, I said. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing. My father blinked, as if he hadn't heard me correctly. Excuse me? He asked. I will not sign it. I repeated. My voice was not loud. It was steady. It was the voice I used in boardrooms when I had to tell a CEO that his CFO was embezzling funds. Brandon let out a scoff that sounded like a bark. What do you mean you won't sign it? You have to sign it. It is the plan. It is your plan, I said, looking at him. It is not mine. My mother withdrew her hand from mine as if I had burned her. Madison, please, she pleaded, her voice pitching up into a whine. Don't be difficult. Not tonight. Not after everything we have been through. Why are you doing this? I looked at her. I saw the genuine confusion in her eyes. She truly could not comprehend a world where I said no. I am not being difficult. Mom, I said, I am being an heir. My father's face turned a shade of red I recognized. It was the color of his temper. You are being selfish, he snapped. You are trying to hold up the family business for what? Money? Is that it? You want a payout? I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. A harsh sound in the quiet room. I don't want a payout. Dad, I said, I just want you to know that I'm not signing away my rights. Not today. Not ever. Brandon stood up too, puffing his chest out. He was used to intimidating me physically, looming over me like he did when we were kids. You are making a huge mistake, he threatened, pointing a finger at my face. You are going to drag this into court? You are going to bleed us dry with legal fees? You will lose. You know that, right? You have no claim. You have never done a thing for these houses. I looked at his finger. Then I looked at his eyes. I almost laughed. It was terrifying how much he believed his own lie. He really thought he was the owner. He really thought he was in control. I did not tell him about the trust. I did not tell him that the title to the house he was standing in, and every other house in the portfolio, had been transferred to my name 4 months ago. I did not tell him that I was not dragging them into court. I was saving them from prison. Not yet. I am willing to take that risk, I said calmly. I turned to my father. I am going to drive back to Denver tonight. I said, I think it is better if I don't stay. My father didn't look at me. He was staring at the unsigned paper on the table, his jaw working furiously. If you walk out that door without signing, he said, his voice low and dangerous, do not expect us to support you when you fail. Do not call us when you need money. You are on your own. I picked up my purse. I looked at the three of them, a tableau of anger and entitlement. Dad, I said, I have been on my own since I was 12 years old. You just never noticed. I walked out of the dining room. I walked through the living room where the photos of Brandon still dominated the mantelpiece. I walked out the front door into the warm Arizona night. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I got into my rental car and locked the doors. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw the silhouette of my mother standing in the window, watching me go. She looked small. I turned onto the main road and headed toward the highway. The desert stretched out around me, vast and dark. They would call me a traitor. They would tell the relatives that I was greedy, that I was ungrateful, that I had ruined the family harmony. They would spend the next few months scrambling, trying to figure out how to bypass my refusal, trying to find a legal loophole to cut me out. Let them... I checked the rearview mirror. The house was gone. I turned on the radio. A classic rock station was playing. I turned the volume up. I had the black folder in a safe deposit box in Denver. I had the truth. And now, I had declared war. They thought I had just started a fight. They didn't know I had already won the war. I just had to wait for them to march onto the battlefield. Back in Denver, my apartment ceased to be a home and became a command center. I pushed my coffee table against the wall, covered my windows with blackout curtains to cut the glare, and laid out the anatomy of a betrayal on the floor. I did not look at the files Grandma Evelyn had given me with the eyes of a grieving granddaughter. I looked at them with the cold, predatory gaze of a senior analyst at Northwind Analytics. I treated my own family like a hostile corporation under audit. I started by digitizing everything. Every receipt, every bank statement, every handwritten note from my grandmother was scanned at high resolution. I created a master spreadsheet, a digital map of the last 24 months. Column A was the revenue my father claimed we were making. Column B was the actual market rate. Column C was the phantom expense category. It took me 3 nights of sleepless work to build the timeline. I correlated Brandon's social media posts with the withdrawal dates. June 12th, a withdrawal of $3,000 for emergency HVAC repair at the Desert Palm property. June 14th, Brandon posts a photo on Instagram from a VIP table at a club in Las Vegas with the caption, "Living the High Life." August 4th, a withdrawal of $4,500 for roof tiling at the Canyon View duplex. August 5th, Brandon drives home in a leased lifted truck with custom rims. The pattern was so obvious it was insulting. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He was robbing the family blind in broad daylight, protected only by the blinding shield of my parents' adoration. But I needed more than just spreadsheets. I needed a weapon that could fire in a courtroom. I hired Samuel Harris. He was a real estate attorney based in downtown Denver, a man with a reputation for being expensive and humorless. I chose him specifically because he had zero connection to Arizona, zero connection to my family's social circle, and zero patience for small-town politics. I sat in his office, which smelled of leather and intimidation, and watched him read the trust and the warranty deeds. He read in silence for 20 minutes. The only sound was the turning of pages and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, he took off his reading glasses and looked at me. "This is aggressive," he said. "Is it legal?" I asked. "Completely," Harris replied. "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. These deeds were recorded in Santa Fe County 2 years ago. The chain of title is unbroken. The trust is the legal owner of all 8 properties, and you are the sole trustee." He leaned forward, tapping the file. "Legally, your parents and your brother have been managing properties they do not own for 24 months. Any income they pocketed is technically theft. Any contracts they signed are voidable. You are not just the heir. Ms. Cole, you are the landlord. They are essentially squatters with keys." Then came the detail that made my blood run cold. I had asked Harris to run a full title search on the properties, just to be thorough. He slid a separate piece of paper across the desk. "There is a complication," he said. "A lien." I picked up the paper. It was a recording of a deed of trust against the Aloe Vera Drive house. "What is this?" I asked. "It appears your brother took out a hard money loan 6 months ago." Harris explained. "He used the house as collateral. It is a high-interest private loan, $50,000. I stared at the number. $50,000. "How could he do that?" I asked. "The house wasn't in his name." "He likely forged a power of attorney or claimed he was acting as the agent for your parents," Harris said. "Private lenders don't always do deep diligence, but here's the problem. Since the house actually belonged to the trust at that time, his signature on that loan is fraud, bank fraud." I sat back in the chair. This wasn't just skimming rent money anymore. Brandon had committed a felony. He had risked the family assets to fund a gambling debt or a bad investment, and he hadn't told anyone. Not me, not Mom, not Dad. I needed to lock this down. I contacted Mr. Henderson, a banker in Santa Fe who had managed Grandma Evelyn's accounts for 30 years. I found his name in her address book. When I called him, his voice softened instantly at the mention of her name. "Evelyn was a sharp woman," Henderson told me. "I remember the day she came in to notarize the trust. She was very clear. Madison, she told me, I love my grandson, but I will not let him drink my legacy." She was afraid. She specifically asked if the trust would protect the houses from reckless heirs. I told her it would. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" I asked. "To her state of mind?" "Any time," Henderson said. "I have my notes from that meeting." That was my character witness. Now I needed a physical witness. I called Riley. We had gone to high school together in Mesa Ridge. She was the only person from that life I still spoke to. She now worked for Sunset Harbor Management, a legitimate property management firm in the valley. "Riley, I need a favor," I said. "I need you to drive by the houses, all 8 of them. Don't let anyone see you. Just take photos. Look at the condition." Is everything okay? She asked. No, I said, but it will be. 2 days later, Riley sent me a Dropbox link. The photos were damning. The new roof on Canyon View? It was patched with tar and clearly leaking. The landscaping overhaul on Desert Palm? The yard was full of dead weeds and trash. The house on Aloe Vera Drive, the one with the $50,000 loan against it, had a broken window that had been boarded up with plywood. But the invoices in my spreadsheet showed that Brandon had billed the family account $4,000 for window replacement last month. He wasn't just stealing the profit, he was letting the assets rot while he drained the accounts. I took every piece of evidence, the spreadsheet, the photos from Riley, the affidavit from Mr. Henderson, the loan documents, and the trust, and I made 3 copies. 1 copy went on to an encrypted hard drive that I put in a safety deposit box at my bank in Denver. 1 copy went to Harris's secure server. And the last copy went into the black fireproof suitcase Grandma had given me. I purged my apartment of any physical paper. I shredded drafts. I wiped my browser history. I was not going to leave a single scrap of paper where my parents could find it if they decided to show up at my door. My phone had been vibrating constantly for a week. My father sent texts that alternated between guilt and anger. Your mother is crying again. Why are you doing this to us? You are being incredibly selfish. Sign the waiver and end this. My mother left voicemails that were even harder to listen to. Madison, honey, please, we can work this out. Brandon is so stressed. He is family. You don't turn your back on family. And Brandon? His texts were short and nasty. You think you are smart? You are nothing. You are going to regret crossing me. I know people in Denver. Watch your back. I did not block them. I needed the record of their harassment. I screenshotted every text and added it to the file. I replied only once. I sent the same message to all 3 of them in a group chat. I am coming to Arizona on Saturday. We will talk when I am there, and when everyone is present. Do not contact me until then. The day before I flew out, I sat in Harris's office one last time. You are ready, he said. The law is on your side. The documentation is perfect. He paused, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. But I need to warn you. Madison, we can win the legal battle. We can recover the assets. We can even put your brother in jail if you want to push the fraud charges. But the moment you drop that file on the table, you are burning the bridge. There is no going back to Sunday dinners after this. You are preparing for a legal victory, but you need to prepare for an emotional funeral. I nodded. I had already mourned them. I had mourned them the day they forgot my 12th birthday. I had mourned them the day I found the fake loan application in my father's office. I know, I said. I am not looking for a family reunion. Mr. Harris, I am looking for a severance package. He handed me the final certified letter from the court in Santa Fe. Then go get it, he said. I went home and packed. I did not pack clothes for a week. I packed for 2 days. I looked at the flight map on my phone. The line from Denver to Phoenix looked short. 1 hour and 40 minutes. I zipped up the black suitcase. It was heavy. It held the weight of 8 houses, $50,000 in fraud, and 20 years of silence. The battle was not going to be fought with screaming matches or thrown vases. It was going to be fought with red stamps and notarized signatures. I was not the little sister anymore. I was the impending lawsuit, and I was right on schedule. I pulled my rental car up to the curb of my parents' house at exactly 7:12 in the evening. I was 12 minutes late. In the world of business, 12 minutes is unprofessional. In the world of family warfare, 12 minutes is a tactical delay. It gave them just enough time to get comfortable, to pour the first round of drinks, and to settle into the narrative they had spent weeks constructing. The house was glowing. Every light was on, beaming out into the Mesa Ridge twilight like a lighthouse warning ships away from the rocks. But tonight, the guests were sailing right into the crash. I walked up the driveway, the wheels of my black suitcase clicking rhythmically against the concrete pavement. I had dressed for the occasion. I was not wearing the comfortable sweaters I usually wore on visits home. I was wearing a charcoal gray suit, sharp heels, and no jewelry except for Grandma Evelyn's ring. I looked like I was going to a deposition, not a dinner party. When I opened the front door, the first thing I saw was the banner. It was strung across the archway leading to the living room. It was professional grade, vinyl, with bold blue lettering that read, Vance Cole Legacy, The Next Chapter. Underneath the text was a blown-up photo of Brandon, wearing a hard hat and holding a set of blueprints, pointing at a horizon that did not exist. He looked like a caricature of a real estate tycoon, a model from a stock photo library. The house was full. My mother had invited everyone. There were neighbors I hadn't seen in 10 years, my father's golf buddies, distant cousins from Phoenix, and, of course, the core family circle. They had turned a legal transaction into a gala. They wanted witnesses. They wanted the transfer of power to be public, so that later, if I ever complained, they could point to this night and say, but everyone was there. Madison, everyone agreed. I stepped into the foyer. Uncle Jerry was the first to spot me. He was holding a scotch and soda, his face already flushed. Madison, he boomed, spilling a little of his drink. You made it. We were worried the city traffic kept you. He looked down at the suitcase next to my leg. Going somewhere? Or did you just get off a flight? You look like you are heading to a board meeting. I smiled, a tight, polite expression that did not reach my eyes. Just some paperwork. Uncle Jerry, I said, I wanted to make sure I had everything I needed. He laughed, slapping me on the shoulder. Always the student. Huh? Well, come on in. The big show is about to start. I rolled the suitcase into the living room and parked it next to the oversized beige sofa, positioning it so it was visible but not in the way. I declined the glass of wine my mother tried to press into my hand. I wanted a clear head. The room was arranged like a theater. Rows of chairs had been set up facing the fireplace, where a projector screen had been pulled down. Standing next to the screen was Mr. Dalton, the family lawyer. He was a man in his 60s with a comb-over and a suit that was 10 years out of style. He looked nervous, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Brandon was working the room. He was shaking hands, clapping men on the back, kissing the cheeks of aunts. He radiated a manic energy. He knew what was coming, or what he thought was coming. He was about to be crowned king. When he saw me, his smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then reassembled itself into something pitying. Glad you could make it, sis, he said, coming over, but not hugging me. He kept a safe distance. I know it is a long trip for just one night, but it means a lot to Mom and Dad. I looked at him. I looked at the slight sweat on his upper lip. I wouldn't miss it. Brandon, I said, I have been looking forward to seeing how you handle the transition. He puffed his chest out. It is going to be a lot of work, he said loudly, ensuring the people nearby could hear, but someone has to step up. Someone has to keep the legacy alive. My father clapped his hands for attention. All right, everyone, if we could take our seats, he announced. We have a little presentation before we get to the legal formalities. The lights dimmed. I took a seat in the back row. On the edge, I was the observer, the auditor. The slideshow began. It was a montage of Brandon's life, carefully curated to erase his failures and highlight his participation. There was a photo of him as a teenager holding a paintbrush in front of one of the rentals. There was a photo of him holding keys. There was a photo of him and Dad shaking hands in front of the aloe vera drive house. The narration was provided by Brandon himself. He stood by the screen, holding a microphone. My parents built this portfolio from nothing, he said, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. They sacrificed everything. And for the last 5 years, it has been my honor to walk in their footsteps, to learn the trade, to protect what they built. He paused for effect. I know some people leave, he said, casting a brief glance toward the back of the room where I sat. Some people choose other paths. They move to big cities. They chase their own dreams, and that is fine. We support that. But the desert is in my blood. Staying here, doing the hard work, that is my dream. The room erupted in applause. My mother was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. My father looked like he had just invented fatherhood. I sat perfectly still. I watched the faces of the guests. There were the believers, my parents' friends who nodded approvingly, buying the story of the prodigal son. There were the opportunists, a cousin who I knew borrowed money from Brandon, clapping the loudest because he needed the Bank of Brandon to stay open. And then there were the neutrals, the neighbors who looked a little bored, wondering when the food would be served. None of them knew they were sitting in a crime scene. The lights came back on. Mr. Dalton stepped forward, clearing his throat. He placed a stack of documents on a small table in front of the fireplace. "Thank you. Brandon." Mr. Dalton said, "Now, to make this official, Robert and Linda have executed a transfer of management and ownership agreement, effectively immediately. The title-holding company for the 8 Arizona properties will be reorganized under Brandon's sole direction." He picked up a document. "We have also included a stipulation," he added, looking over his reading glasses at me, "that upon the future profitability of the portfolio, a discretionary trust may be established for Madison, subject to the manager's approval. A crumb, a promise of a ghost of a dollar, controlled by the very person who was stealing from them." My father stood up. He walked over to the table. Brandon joined him. They looked like statesmen signing a treaty. "This is the right thing to do," my father said, his voice booming. "We are keeping it in the family. We are keeping it safe." Mr. Dalton uncapped a heavy fountain pen. He held it out to Brandon. "Just sign right here, son, beside the grantee line, and then Robert will sign as grantor." The room went silent, respectful of the moment. I saw Brandon reach for the pen. I saw his hand tremble slightly, not from fear, but from greed. He was seconds away from thinking he had gotten away with $50,000 of fraud and 2 years of theft. I stood up. I did not clear my throat. I did not raise my hand. I simply stood up and grabbed the handle of my black suitcase. I began to walk toward the front of the room. The wheels of the suitcase were hard rubber. On the polished oak floor, they made a distinct, low rumbling sound. Rumble, rumble, rumble. It was a jarring noise in the quiet room. Heads turned. People shifted in their seats. Brandon froze, the pen inches from the paper. He looked up, annoyed. "Madison?" he said. "What are you doing? We are in the middle of the signing." I did not stop walking until I was standing directly between the guests and the table. I was blocking their view of the success. I was center stage. I looked at Mr. Dalton. Then I looked at my father. Finally, I rested my gaze on Brandon. "I am sorry to interrupt the show," I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used when I had to tell a client that their numbers did not add up. "But before you sign that, Brandon, and before Dad signs that, I need to make sure everyone in this room understands exactly what is being signed." My father's face went purple. "Madison, sit down," he hissed. "This is not the time for your drama. We discussed this." "We did not discuss this. Dad," I said, "you dictated. I listened. Now, it is my turn to speak." I knelt down. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector fan cooling down. I placed my hand on the latches of the suitcase. Click, the left latch opened. Click, the right latch opened. The sound was sharp, like a pistol being cocked. Brandon lowered the pen. He looked at the suitcase, then at me. For the first time all night, the arrogance slipped from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion and a dawning, cold dread. He didn't know what was in there, but he knew me, and he knew that I never played games I hadn't already won. I stood up, leaving the lid closed for one more second. I looked at the crowd. "You are all here to witness a transfer of assets." I said to the room, "So am I. But the assets we are talking about aren't quite what you think they are." I reached down and threw the lid open. I reached into the suitcase and pulled out the first item. It was the black binder Grandma Evelyn had given me that night in Santa Fe. It landed on the coffee table with a heavy, dull thud that echoed in the silence. I did not look at Brandon. I looked at Mr. Dalton. "Mr. Dalton," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, "I know you prepared the transfer documents for tonight, based on the assumption that my parents hold the title to these properties. But before you let them sign a warranty deed, I think you need to review the current chain of title. I slid the binder toward him. This is the original Evelyn Vance Family Trust, I said. Executed 2 years ago, notarized, and fully funded. I reached back into the suitcase and pulled out a second stack of papers. These were thinner, stapled individually. And these, I continued, laying them out like a royal flush in a poker game, are the recorded deeds for all 8 properties: Aloe Vera Drive, Canyon View, the 4-bedroom on Desert Palm. Every single one of them was transferred into the trust 24 months ago. They have been recorded with the Santa Fe County Clerk. Mr. Dalton frowned. He adjusted his glasses and picked up the trust document. He flipped through the first few pages quickly, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he saw the dates. He stopped at the signature page. He ran his thumb over the embossed notary seal. He looked up at my father, then at me. His face had drained of color. "Robert," Mr. Dalton said, his voice quiet but audible. This appears to be valid. The grantor is Evelyn Vance. The trustee is Madison Cole. The beneficiary is Madison Cole. My father stood up so fast his chair tipped over. "That is impossible," he sputtered. "Mom would never do that. She didn't even understand trusts. She barely left the house." "She understood enough," I said. "She understood that her legacy was being treated like a piggy bank." I took a step forward, addressing the room. I saw the neighbors exchanging glances. I saw the smiles fading from the faces of the sycophants. "On the day Grandma died, she didn't just leave me a house," I said. "She left me a mission. She wanted to protect these assets from anyone who would use them for personal gain, and she specifically named the person she was protecting them from." I pointed to the screen, where the slide of Brandon holding the blueprints was still frozen, smiling down at his own destruction. "Brandon," I said. "This is a lie," Brandon shouted. He lunged forward and grabbed one of the deeds from the table. He crumpled it in his fist. "She forged this. She's just jealous because I'm the one who actually does the work. I'm the one managing the repairs." "Are you?" I asked. I pulled the third item from my suitcase, the spreadsheet. I had blown it up and printed it on large, 11 by 17 paper so the rows were visible. "Let's talk about those repairs. Brandon," I said. I held the paper up for the front row to see. "This is a forensic accounting of the property bank accounts for the last 18 months, I explained. Highlighted in yellow are payments to a vendor called Desert Sky Maintenance. Over $40,000 in payments. I looked at Uncle Jerry in the front row. "Uncle Jerry, you are a contractor. Have you ever heard of Desert Sky Maintenance?" Jerry blinked, caught off guard. "No," he muttered. "Never heard of 'em." "That is because they don't exist," I said. "There is no business license, no tax ID. The address listed on the invoices is a P.O. box in Scottsdale, and the bank account associated with that P.O. box." I turned to look directly at Brandon. He was breathing hard, his face slick with sweat. "The account belongs to Brandon Cole," I said. "He has been writing checks for fake roof repairs and depositing them into his personal savings account to pay off, well, I assume gambling debts, given the transactions at the casino ATMs that follow every deposit." A gasp rippled through the room. It wasn't a theatrical gasp. It was the genuine, horrified sound of people realizing they had been clapping for a thief. "That is slander!" my mother shrieked. She rushed to Brandon's side, grabbing his arm. "How dare you accuse your brother of stealing? He works day and night. Grandma would be ashamed of you." "Would she?" I asked. I turned toward the back of the room, near the archway where the refreshments were set up. Standing there, holding a glass of water, was a man in a gray suit who had slipped in quietly when the slideshow started. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "would you please step forward?" The room turned. Mr. Henderson walked toward the center. He was a dignified man in his 60s, with the calm authority of someone who has managed money for 40 years. "For those who don't know," I said, "Mr. Henderson was Grandma Evelyn's personal banker in Santa Fe for 3 decades. Mr. Henderson stopped near the fireplace. He looked at my father with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "Robert," he said, "I was there the day Evelyn signed these papers. I helped her arrange the notary. She was perfectly lucid. In fact, she was more sharp that day than I had seen her in years. She told me," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice steady, "that she loved her family, but she could not watch her husband's hard work be squandered on vanity projects. She told me specifically that she needed to put the houses in a lockbox, and that Madison was the only one with the key." My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. He slumped back against the wall. "But why didn't she tell us?" "She tried," I said. "You just never listened." I walked over to the laptop connected to the sound system. "And just in case you think Mr. Henderson is lying," I said, "or that I manipulated an old woman," I pressed the spacebar. The speakers, which had just been playing Brandon's heroic narration, crackled to life. My grandmother's voice filled the room. It was slightly raspy, but undeniable. "If they force you to sign, Madison, just let them talk. Let them think they have won until the paper speaks. I know my son. He is a good man, but he is weak when it comes to that boy. You have to be strong enough for both of them." The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Brandon was shaking. He looked at the deed in his hand, then at the guests. He saw the shift in their eyes. He saw the disgust. He saw the judgment. The hero narrative had collapsed, leaving only the ugly framework of fraud exposed. "It is still fake," Brandon whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Dalton, tell them. We received notice of ownership transfers, right? We would have known." Mr. Dalton was flipping through the deeds again. He looked sick. "Actually," the lawyer said, his voice trembling, "since the properties are in New Mexico, the recording notices go to the county of record. My office, we wouldn't necessarily get a notification unless we ran a title search, which we haven't done since the original purchase." He looked at my father. "Robert, these are real. The recording stamps are authentic. The dates match. Legally, the house we are standing in right now belongs to the trust. It belongs to Madison." My father looked at me. His eyes were wide, pleading, searching for the daughter he thought he could bully into submission. "You knew," he said hoarsely. "You knew all this time. Why did you let us plan this party? Why did you let us humiliate ourselves?" "I didn't let you do anything," I said. "I gave you a chance. 2 days ago, I put a waiver on this table. I gave you a chance to treat me with respect. I gave you a chance to ask me what I wanted. Instead, you threatened to cut me off. You told me I was nothing." I looked at the banner, the next chapter. I just wanted to make sure that when the next chapter started, everyone knew who was actually writing it. The whispers started then. I heard bits and pieces, embezzlement, forged checks, poor Madison. The tide had turned. The guests began to shift toward the door, sensing that the free wine was no longer worth the discomfort. But I wasn't finished. I reached into the suitcase one last time. "There is one more thing," I said. I pulled out a single document. It was a deed of trust, a mortgage. "Brandon," I said, holding it up, "you might be able to talk your way out of the fake repairs. You might be able to cry to Mom that you made a mistake." I took a step toward him. "But this is a lien against the Aloe Vera Drive property. $50,000. Hard money loan, high interest." My mother gasped. "A loan? But the house is paid off." "It was," I said, "until 6 months ago, when Brandon signed a document claiming he had power of attorney for the owner, which he didn't, and borrowed $50,000 against the equity." I dropped the paper on the table. It slid over the top of the trust, covering Brandon's victory banner in the slideshow background. "That is bank fraud, Brandon," I said. "That is a federal crime. If I take this to the district attorney, you don't just lose the houses. You go to prison for 5 to 10 years. Brandon looked at the paper. He looked at me. For the first time in his life, he looked small. I can fix it," he stammered. "I just need time. The market is turning. The market is done, I cut him off. I looked at my father, then at my mother. So here's the deal, I said. If you want to keep pretending you are a happy family, you can. But if you try to fight this trust, or if you try to claim that I manipulated Grandma, I will hand this entire file to the authorities. I will have Brandon arrested before breakfast tomorrow. I pointed to the door. Or, I said, you can sit down, shut up, and listen to how I am going to run my properties from now on. The room was absolutely still. My father looked at Brandon, then at the evidence of his son's betrayal. He looked old. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of the truth. He pulled out his chair and sat down. My mother looked at Brandon, waiting for him to fight, to yell, to be the golden boy, but Brandon just stared at the floor, the crumpled deed falling from his hand. He sat down too. I stood at the head of the table, the suitcase open, the projector humming behind me. Good, I said. Now, let's look at the new lease agreements. The silence that followed my declaration was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a structure collapsing, the groaning of steel beams giving way under too much weight. Brandon was the first to break it. He did not lunge at me this time. The fight had drained out of his posture, replaced by a frantic, cornered desperation. He looked around the room, seeking an ally, but finding only averted gazes and the cold, judgmental stare of the projector lens still beaming his face onto the screen. "You are ruining this family," he choked out. His voice was no longer the boom of the CEO. It was the whine of the child who had been caught with his hand in the jar. "Do you hear yourself? Madison? You come in here with your spreadsheets and your lawyers, and you tear everything apart. You are destroying us over money, over bricks and mortar." He turned to our parents, his hands spread wide in a plea that had worked for 30 years. "Mom, Dad, are you going to let her do this? She is humiliating me. She is humiliating us. She is turning a celebration into a witch hunt." I stood perfectly still, my hand resting on the cover of the black binder. The leather was warm under my palm. "I am not the one who took out a $50,000 loan against a house I didn't own," I said. My voice was low, but in that acoustic vacuum, it carried like a gunshot. "I am not the one who forged invoices. I am not the one who gambled away the maintenance fund." I looked him in the eye. "This family started destroying itself the moment you decided that Grandma Evelyn didn't know how to count." The sentence hung in the air. I saw my father flinch as if I had slapped him. That was the core of it, wasn't it? They had all assumed Grandma was just a prop, a senile old woman in a rocking chair, useful for holiday photos, but irrelevant to the real business of men. They had bet their entire future on her ignorance, and they had lost. My mother let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She was sitting on the edge of the sofa, her hands clutching a napkin so tight her knuckles were white. But she wasn't looking at Brandon. She was looking at me. For the first time in my life, I saw her actually look at me, not as the low-maintenance daughter, not as the one who didn't need anything, but as a stranger she had lived with for 2 decades. "I thought," she stammered, tears spilling onto her silk blouse. "I thought you were happy in Denver. I thought you didn't care about these things. We always said Madison is so independent. She doesn't need us." "I didn't need you," I corrected her gently. "I needed parents. What I got were roommates who preferred my brother." She buried her face in her hands. Her grief wasn't just about the money, or even the shock of Brandon's theft. It was the crushing realization that her definition of me, the convenient, easy child, was a lie she had told herself to excuse her own neglect. She cried because she realized that while she was busy polishing Brandon's crown, I had been building a fortress she wasn't allowed to enter. The room remained uncomfortable, heavy with the sound of my mother's weeping. Then, a chair scraped against the floor at the back of the room. It was Cousin Mark. He was a distant relative, a quiet man who worked in HVAC repair and usually stood in the corners at these gatherings, nursing a single beer. He cleared his throat, looking nervous but determined. I have to say something," Mark said. He looked at my father, then at Brandon. About 3 months ago, I ran into Brandon at a bar in Scottsdale. He was with some friends. He didn't see me. Brandon's head snapped up. "Shut up, Mark. Nobody cares what you heard." "I care," my father said. His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. "Go on, Mark." Mark twisted his baseball cap in his hands. He was bragging about the inheritance. He told his buddies that. He said his parents were clueless dinosaurs who would sign anything he put in front of them. The air left the room. He said Grandma was half dead and totally out of it. Mark continued, his voice shaking slightly. And he said that once the papers were signed, he was going to liquidate 2 of the properties immediately to buy a boat. He said, "The money is practically mine already. They just don't know it yet." Mark sat down. The testimony hit harder than the bank statements. The bank statements were math. This was malice. My father stood up slowly. He walked over to the table where the evidence lay spread out. He didn't look at me. He looked at the spreadsheet with the fake company name. He looked at the loan document. He looked at the glossy photo of Brandon on the banner. The next chapter. He picked up the loan document. His hands were shaking. "I trusted you," my father whispered. He didn't shout. It would have been better if he had shouted. Instead, he sounded hollowed out. "I didn't check. I didn't audit. I just believed you because you were my son." He looked up at Brandon, and the look of betrayal on his face was absolute. It was the look of a man realizing that his entire legacy was a joke, and he was the punchline. "You called us dinosaurs?" my father asked. "You were stealing from us while we were planning your party?" "Dad, it was just talk," Brandon pleaded. But he was shrinking in his chair, the confidence evaporating like water on hot pavement. "I was drunk. I didn't mean it." "You meant it enough to cash the checks," I said. Then came the final blow. It didn't come from me. From the corner of the room, near the window, my younger cousin Noah spoke up. Noah was 19, a computer science major who usually spent family gatherings with his headphones on, ignored by everyone, especially Brandon, who liked to call him a nerd. "She wasn't alone, you know," Noah said. Everyone turned to look at him. He was sitting with his laptop open on his knees. "Grandma Evelyn," Noah clarified. "She wasn't alone when she organized this. She called me 2 years ago. She asked me if I knew how to scan documents to the cloud." I looked at Noah, surprised. I hadn't known this part. "She was worried," Noah said, looking directly at Brandon. She said, "Noah, paper can get lost. Paper can get burned. I need this to be safe." So I drove to Santa Fe. I spent a weekend scanning every single deed, every receipt, every letter she wrote to the bank. It is all backed up on 3 different secure servers. I have the logs. He turned his laptop screen around. It showed a folder structure, neatly organized by date. "She didn't just trust Madison," Noah said. "She trusted the people you guys never looked at. She knew we would protect the truth because we had nothing to gain from the lie." I felt a lump form in my throat. Grandma hadn't just given me the power. She had built a network. She had weaponized the invisible members of the family against the loud ones. She knew that while Brandon was busy being the star, Noah and I were the ones watching the stage machinery. Mr. Dalton, the family lawyer, had seen enough. He began shoving papers back into his briefcase with frantic speed. "Robert, Linda," he said, his voice tight. "Given the new evidence, specifically the existence of a prior recorded trust and the allegations of fraud, I cannot proceed with this transfer. In fact, I need to recuse myself from this entire matter immediately. If these documents are real, any attempt to move assets now would be criminal conspiracy." He didn't wait for a goodbye. He snapped his briefcase shut and walked out the front door, fleeing the sinking ship before the water reached his neck. That was the signal. The party was officially dead. Brandon slumped in his chair. He looked at the empty space where his lawyer had been. He looked at the guests who were now whispering openly, some even taking out their phones to text the gossip to others. "She can't do this to me," Brandon muttered. He was staring at the floor. She can't just cut me out. I am the oldest. It is my right. He wasn't talking about me. He was talking about Grandma. She isn't doing anything to you, Brandon, I said coldly. She is dead. You are doing this to yourself. She promised, Brandon yelled suddenly, slamming his fist into his thigh. She always said the family takes care of its own. She did take care of her own, I replied. She took care of the assets. She took care of the legacy. The only thing she didn't take care of was your entitlement. I looked at him, a 30-year-old man who still spoke like a child who had been denied a toy. He didn't see Grandma as a person. He didn't see her as a matriarch who had scrubbed floors and saved pennies to buy that first duplex. He saw her as a vending machine that had malfunctioned. I stepped back from the table. I felt a strange sense of detachment. For years, I had replayed this moment in my head. I had imagined screaming. I had imagined throwing the papers in their faces. I had imagined a cathartic explosion of rage. But now that it was here, it was quiet. It was clinical. The room was a tableau of ruin. My mother was weeping on the sofa, mourning the fiction of her happy family. My father was staring at a spreadsheet, mourning his own competence. Brandon was muttering to the floor, mourning his unearned future. And the guests, the audience for this grand play, were realizing that the curtain had fallen on a tragedy, not a triumph. I stood near the black suitcase. I didn't need to say anything else. The papers had done the talking. The numbers had done the screaming. I looked at the banner one last time. Vance Cole Legacy. The legacy was safe now, but the family? The family was gone. And as I watched them crumble under the weight of their own secrets, I realized that I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I just felt free. I checked my watch. 8:45. The notary I had hired to secure the premises, a precautionary measure Harris had suggested, would be arriving in 15 minutes to change the locks on the rental office. The script was no longer theirs. The director had changed. "Dad," I said, breaking his trance. He looked up at me. His eyes were red, rimmed with age and exhaustion. "We need to talk about the management transition," I said, "and we need to do it before the police get involved." I didn't wait for his permission. I pulled out a chair, the one at the head of the table, where he usually sat, and I sat down. Samuel Harris, the attorney I had hired in Denver, finally stepped out of the shadows near the archway. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, silent as a statue, holding a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Brandon's truck. He walked to the table, not with the frantic energy of Mr. Dalton, but with the heavy, deliberate stride of an executioner. He placed a single sheet of paper on top of the pile of evidence I had already laid out. "My name is Samuel Harris," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I represent Ms. Cole in her capacity as the sole trustee of the Evelyn Vance Family Trust." He looked at my father, then at Brandon. "What you see on the table is a certified confirmation from the Santa Fe County Court. It verifies that the trust is active, the deeds are recorded, and the title transfer was completed 24 months ago." He paused, letting the legal reality sink in. "That means, Robert, that you and Linda do not own these houses. You have not owned them for 2 years. You have no legal standing to gift them, transfer them, or manage them. Any document you prepared for tonight is not worth the paper it is printed on." Brandon stood up. His face was blotchy, a mix of rage and panic. He looked like a man watching his life raft deflate. "This is insane," he sputtered. "We can split it, okay? Madison, let us just split it. 50-50. You take 4 houses, I take 4. We keep it in the family. We don't need outsiders." When I didn't answer, his tone shifted instantly from bargaining to threatening. "If you don't agree to a split, I will sue you," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I will sue you for undue influence. I will tell the judge you manipulated a senile old woman into signing everything over to you. I will tie this up in court for 10 years. You won't see a dime." "Mr. Harris laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Cole," he said, looking at Brandon with cold amusement. "Before you threaten a lawsuit, you should look at the spreadsheet your sister provided." Harris tapped the document showing the fake repairs. "We have evidence of over $40,000 in embezzlement. We have proof of bank fraud regarding the $50,000 loan on the aloe vera property in the state of Arizona and New Mexico. These are felonies." Harris leaned in closer. "If you file a lawsuit, we will file a criminal complaint. The district attorney is very interested in cases where seniors are defrauded by family members. So, I suggest you be very careful about your next sentence. It might be used against you at your sentencing hearing." The room went dead silent. The threat of prison hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Brandon's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Dad, but Dad was staring at the table, unable to meet his son's eyes. Every eye in the room turned to me. The neighbors, the cousins, the friends. They were all waiting. They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to scream, to flip the table, to kick Brandon out of the house. They expected the kind of revenge they saw in movies. But I was not there to create a scene. I was there to end one. I turned to my father. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The patriarch mask had crumbled, leaving behind just a tired, confused man. "Dad," I said softly. He looked up. "Dad, don't you know?" I asked. He blinked, confused by the question. "Don't you know that Grandma saw this coming?" I continued. "She didn't do this to hurt you. She didn't do this to punish Brandon. She did this because she knew that if she left the cookie jar open, you would let him eat until he was sick." I touched the black binder. "I didn't steal anything. Dad, I didn't rob you. I am just letting the paperwork answer the questions you were too afraid to ask. You spent your whole life listening to the child who shouted the loudest. Grandma decided to leave the keys to the child who listened." I took a breath. It felt clean. It felt like the air in Denver. "Here is how this is going to work," I said. I was not asking. I was informing. "Effective immediately, the management of all 8 properties will be transferred to Sunset Harbor Management. I have already signed the contract with them. They will handle rent collection, repairs, and tenant relations." I looked at Brandon. "Brandon is terminated. He is not to step foot on any of the properties. He is not to contact any of the tenants. If he does, he will be trespassing." Brandon flinched. "And regarding the money," I said, "I am not going to call the police tonight. I am going to give you a choice. You can sign a promissory note agreeing to repay the $40,000 you stole, plus the $50,000 to clear the lien over the next 5 years. Or, Mr. Harris will hand this file to the authorities on Monday morning." My father stood up. His hands were shaking. "Madison," he said, his voice cracking, "you can't do that. He is your brother. You can't treat him like a criminal. Don't do this to him." I looked at my father, even now, with the evidence of theft staring him in the face. His instinct was to protect the golden boy. He wanted me to absorb the loss so Brandon didn't have to face the consequence. I interrupted him. My voice was not loud, but it was final. "I am not doing anything to him. Dad," I said, "he did this to himself. He wrote the checks. He signed the fraudulent loan. He spent the money. All I am doing is turning on the light so you can see the mess he made." I reached for the black suitcase. I picked up the trust binder and placed it inside. I picked up the deeds and placed them inside. I picked up the spreadsheet and the photos of the ruined houses and placed them inside. I closed the lid. Click, the left latch snapped shut. Click, the right latch snapped shut. The sound was like a gavel hitting a bench. It was the sound of an era ending, the era of favors, of looking the other way, of unspoken resentments. It was all locked inside that box now. I stood up and extended the handle of the suitcase. I turned to walk away. My mother jumped up from the sofa. She ran toward me, grabbing my arm. Her face was streaked with mascara, her eyes wild with a sudden, terrifying realization that she was losing control. "Madison, wait," she cried. "You can't just leave like this. We are a family. You can't just walk out the door." I stopped. I looked at her hand on my arm. It was the same hand that used to wave dismissively when I asked for help with my homework. It was the same hand that had signed checks for Brandon's cars while telling me we couldn't afford a math tutor. I gently removed her hand from my sleeve. "Mom," I said, "I have been here for 20 years. I was sitting right at that table. I was in the corner. I was in the shadow. You just never saw me because I wasn't the one you were looking for." I took a step back. "I am not leaving because I am angry," I said. "I am leaving because I am finished. Today is the first time I am walking out that door because I chose to, not because I was pushed." I turned around. The crowd of relatives parted like the Red Sea. They stepped back, giving me a wide berth. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. They had come to watch a coronation, and they had witnessed a revolution. I walked through the foyer, past the banner that still declared the next chapter. I walked out the front door into the heat. The Arizona night was thick and warm, smelling of dust and dried sage. It was the smell of my childhood, but tonight, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt vast. I walked to my rental car and opened the back door. I placed the black suitcase on the seat. I buckled it in. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The air conditioning blasted cold air against my face. I pulled away from the curb. I did not look at the window to see if they were watching. I knew they were. I knew my father was slumped in his chair. I knew my mother was crying. I knew Brandon was staring at a repayment plan that would take him half a decade to clear. I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was glowing in the distance, the big, impressive stucco house where I had learned that love was conditional and silence was a weapon. I watched it shrink. It got smaller and smaller as I drove down the street. It became a toy house, then a speck of light. Then, as I turned the corner onto the highway leading back to the airport, it disappeared completely. I did not turn on the radio. I just drove in the silence, listening to the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I was going back to Denver, back to my apartment with the brick walls, back to my job where numbers were respected, back to the life I had built with my own hands. I had come to distribute the inheritance, and I had left with the only thing that really belonged to me, my freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed this journey of justice and resilience. If you are listening to this, please comment below and tell me where you are tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And please, do not forget to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people who need to hear it. Your support means the world to me.